It's the last one. I'll be as quick and interesting and exciting as I possibly can, given the subject of regulations for AI medical devices. People have touched on medical devices. They've touched on this process. And if you listen to the tone of the way that they say it, they all kind of dread it and fear it. And I'm here to say it's not actually that scary. Me and my team have done this over 130 times, so we know how to get regulated medical devices to market. And I'm here to explain to you guys the overview, the high-level concepts of what the regulations entail. And hopefully by the end you'll agree they're actually really common sense and logical. So the first thing, before I tell you about what the regulations are, we need to be on the same page about what is a medical device. This is the lowest risk medical device. It's a wooden tongue depressor. Your GP will put this in your mouth when you say "ah," so they can just move the tongue down and look at the back of your throat. This is regulated. This is a Class 1 sterile device. It has to be sterilized because obviously you don't want a dirty, yucky piece of wood put in your mouth. It also has to be sterilized because it can kill babies. There was a case report of 4 kids in intensive care who died from nosocomial infections. People were using wooden tongue depressors outside of their regulated intended use to splint babies' arms. So when a cannula or Venflon was being put in the baby's vein, the baby's arm was being held stiff, and they weren't using the padding that's shown there. How do I do the laser? There we go. This padding here. They weren't using that padding, they were using these wooden splints outside of their regulated intended use. In the warm, moist environment of the incubator, they grew these weird and wonderful fungal infections and 4 babies died. This is why we have regulations. So what are regulations? They are rules, often enshrined in law, especially for medical devices, that require people who make products or provide services to make sure they meet agreed quality standards so that we ensure that that product or service is safe, trustworthy, works as claimed, and that the manufacturer has taken steps to being responsible for their product. And regulations save lives. And if you don't believe me, you can ask the occupants of this unregulated submarine. So that's why we have regulations. And I hate to start with a shocking thing, but I find it grabs people's attention and they start to think, okay, well, maybe we do need to be safety conscious and be aware of these things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the regulations are and who they're for. We're going to look at what are the pertinent regulatory frameworks for the UK, what you or your colleagues, your academics or your startups that you work with, what they should be aware of, and some practical tips. And like I said, I've done this hundreds of times now, so there are bumps in the road which are quite regularly hit upon by people attempting this journey. The first thing to look at is the regulatory frameworks. Now, we're in a post-Brexit state, so we used to be part of Europe, now we kind of stand alone. So it's important to know that there are different regulations that apply to us as applied to Europe, but we're in this kind of weird flux position where we still accept things that are regulated by Europe because we don't want to cut ourselves off from that market. The Europeans don't accept things that are regulated by Britain. We have to use their regulations. So there's no real give and take here. But by and large, for medical device patient safety, it's the column on the left. So we have the Medicines and Medical Devices Act of 2021, and we had an updated bit of regulation after Brexit, which applied to the UK medical device regulation. In the EU, they have the EU medical device regulation, which was updated in 2021. These dates are important because we still use UK law, which is based on the old European law. And so we are kind of like a step behind the Europeans in terms of the robustness of our regulation. That's the medical device side. As has been alluded to earlier, these are software medical devices that we're going to be talking about. So the other rules about data protection and cybersecurity apply. Now we have UK GDPR, which basically we just crossed out EU and written UK on it. What we don't have is the EU AI Act, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of. This is the biggest piece of legislation the EU ever produced, and it covers all AI products in any sector, but it does also apply to medical devices in the EU. And of course, we've got EU GDPR. So those are the frameworks that you're working within, and you can't pretend they don't exist. They all do. And they are constantly changing and evolving. By 2026, the UK will have performed consultations to update their regulations, and we are likely to align more with the Europeans. I don't know about whether we'll align with the AI Act or not, but that's something that people are working on in government circles. So what is a medical device? So these are the two definitions from the EU law on the left and the UK law on the right. And you can see we did Brexit in a rush. We copied and pasted everything apart from one word. Where was it? Here we go. Prognosis is in the EU, but it's not in the UK. I have no idea why they left that out, but there we go. Otherwise, it's pretty much word for word identical. So we have copied and pasted the European regulations. So you might as well read those regulations, and they apply to the UK. So the number one question is, are you building a medical device? Time and time again, I see academics or even startups accidentally stumble into the area of regulated medical devices. And it can be quite jarring to realize you've built something that someone else is going to want to independently check that you've built properly. You're like, well, of course I built it properly. I put my heart and sweat into this. How dare you suggest that it needs to be regulated? But it does, because of those kind of risks that I've highlighted earlier. And these are the basic rules. If you want to use software, and I'm particularly referencing AI software here, to inform or drive any of these things for any medical condition, disease, injury, or disability, it is a medical device, whether you like to admit it or not. And building any AI system should align, obviously, with the regulatory requirements for safety and effectiveness. And these are the questions that the regulators will ask you. There's three questions which, if none of them apply, then you haven't built a medical device. But the first one is, obviously, is it intended for a medical purpose, which were those listed, diagnosis, prevention, treatment, and things like that? Or is it an accessory for another medical device? The second question is, what kind of processing is it doing? Is it doing anything more than a simple calculation? And a really interesting point here is that it actually specifies, is it doing anything more than lossless compression? So lossless compression is when you take a bunch of data and you compress it in size, so it's more easily transferable, but you don't lose any of the fidelity of the data. What this means is that if you're doing lossy compression, where you do lose fidelity of the data, i.e. you can't uncompress it back to its original form, that's a medical device. And that means that any large language model used in medicine is a medical device, because large language models compress data and you cannot get back the prompt that you put in. So that's a top tip there. And the third question is, does it benefit individual patients? So you're not a medical device if you're doing population screening, for instance, because that doesn't benefit individual patients. So if you can answer those three questions, then and none of them, the answer is no, then you are building a medical device. The MHRA also has some excellent guidance on different variations of calculations. So just to highlight the point, simple calculators, i.e. just doing plus, minus, times, and divide, not a medical device. If you're doing anything more, intermediate calculations, complex calculations, lookup tables, or AI, linear models, deep learning models, anything, then this is likely to be a medical device. And these are the indicative phrases. If you're using an equation, a risk score, a formula, or an algorithm, then you're probably building a medical device as well. We're in a grey area. The regulations are not specific about every single use case of software or AI. And so we have this kind of grey zone between definitely being a medical device. So clinical decision support in the EU and UK is a medical device. Predicting health outcomes, diagnosing or measuring things, that's a medical device. What's not a medical device is anything in the research space necessarily. If it's just assisting research, we saw some good examples earlier. Medical coding and billing does not count as benefiting an individual patient, nor does training education. But then you have this grey zone, and you're seeing these a lot now in the NHS, medical scribes and transcription services, kind of in this weird zone. Like, you are processing medical data for an individual patient in a medical context. Kind of sounds like a medical device, right? EHR enhancement, so Epic and all the big EHR documentation providers, they're just slamming calculators and risk scores and everything into their software. A lot of them are medical devices. And you could argue that automated patient communication could be considered a medical device if you are informing management for that patient. If you're saying on an automated way, you should take your drug tomorrow, that's changing the management of an individual patient intended for a medical purpose. So that could be a medical device. But these are grey kind of zones. And the regulations and guidance are constantly updated. So these will become clearer over time. And of course, in 10 years' time, we'll have invented even more technologies and more use cases, so the grey zone will grow even bigger. So how do you actually really nail down whether you're a medical device or not? So this is the first piece of regulatory documentation that you would write. It's called an intended use statement or an intended purpose. It's a required piece in the regulations, and you have to include these 6 descriptors. It's important to be really, really, really specific about all of these. So when it says you have to look at your intended users and your intended purpose, you don't just say my intended users is patients. You have to say which patients, what demographics, what disease do they have, what severity of disease, what stage of treatment are they on. I'd be very, very specific, for instance. You have to outline the principles of operation. You have to give a rationale for the qualification of why it is a medical device, going back to those questions I showed you, and then the risk class of the device. This has been updated by the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, saying that software as a medical device also provides means and suggestions for mitigation of a disease. So even if you're not diagnosing a disease, but just suggesting a way to mitigate, like not to get a disease, that could be a medical device as well, including all of these other things here that it says on the slide, which I think are more obvious. There are risk classes of devices. The wooden tongue depressors I showed you are class 1, the lowest risk. There is also class 3, the highest risk. So the highest risk device that I know of would be something like a PET scanner, which is emitting radiation, and you can kill a patient by pressing the wrong button. And all software, this is under the risk classification internationally, is class 1 unless it provides information used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapy, making it class 2A. And this rule is a very, very much debated rule, but it essentially means that 99% of any software application is a class 2A device. And the difference is class 1 devices are not reviewed by regulatory authorities. Class 2 and above do need a regulatory authority review. And going back to the Brexit situation, in Europe, pretty much all software is class 2A. We're still under the old rules where you can do class 1 under the UK MDR, but that is likely to change, and we're likely to see a shift from class 1 devices in the UK go up to class 2 because of this wording in this rule. Obviously, if your device does something more serious, then it's up class. So if it can cause a serious deterioration in health or require a surgical intervention, then it'd be class 2B. So this is typically for people with acute stroke or cancers, or if it could potentially have an impact on decision-making that could cause death or irreversible deterioration, then it's class 3. I've only done, out of the 140 or so devices that I've helped with, only one has been a class 3 software device. And then this is the table that you would look up, and you draw this up in your intended purpose statement, and you say, right, I think because we're driving clinical management in cancer patients, therefore we'll be a class 2B device. Now you know where you stand. You're a medical device, you know what risk class you are. And then this is more for the American side. They split devices up into these 3 categories, but it's useful to think about them for your use cases as well. Are you doing CAD-T, CAD-E, or CAD-X? Triage, detection, or diagnosis? Be very clear on the difference. Triage is saying this patient should be seen before that patient, but you're not saying why. You're just triaging a patient. Detection would be saying, I think there's something in a blood test or on an image, but you're not saying what it is. Diagnosis, you're saying, there is this thing. I found a stroke. I found a cancer. So there are different levels of risk associated with them. You have to know the limitations of the AI. You have to know when AI gets it wrong, because to date, I've never heard anyone claim an AI is 100% accurate. So you have to understand the different types of error. And of course, not to forget, because it's software, you have to be really hot on your data protection and cybersecurity risks, especially misuse of personal data. And again, like the tongue depressor, you have to kind of be creative and think of foreseeable misuse of your device. And often with software, we see that people develop maybe a triage or detection system, but the misuse is that the clinicians rely on them for diagnosis. So that's using an AI product off-label. So you need to think about what's known as these foreseeable misuses. Another one is human reliance on AI automation. So we are seeing a lot of these medical scribes being used in hospitals, and because the doctors are so time pressured, they're just accepting what the medical scribe has said, but there's hallucinations in that documentation. And that's going to start to cause patient safety issues down the line. The other thing you need to consider is what's known as clinical benefit. So now you know you are a device, you know what risk class you are, you've thought about misuse of your device, you've thought about data security and cybersecurity. So what? What's the actual tangible clinical benefit? And this is what the first thing that regulators want you to demonstrate. It's not the accuracy of your device per se, it's the benefit of being that accurate. So for instance, you have to measure something that is meaningful and measurable and patient relevant. So the patients in the room will always like that term. It has to be meaningful, measurable, and patient relevant. So for an example, if your AI is 95% accurate at detecting a cancer, that's not the benefit. The benefit is either you're claiming a time saving or you're claiming an increase in diagnostic performance by the health service. Like you have to tangibly measure that as well as your accuracy. And then the final thing to say is that your marketing should also align with your claimed clinical benefit. What I'm seeing a lot, especially on social media, is a lot of AI companies in the health tech space will tell the regulators one thing and then market their device as almost being sort of this sort of godlike sentient being that can do anything. Babylon Health was a very big example of this. I worked at Babylon Health. I got the first Class 1 regulatory approval for it as a triage device because it was a little chatbot that would tell you to go to your GP or A&E depending on your symptoms. And the CEO would go on stage and go, "We can diagnose any disease." And I'd be like, "Oh, you've just upclassed us to Class 2B. What are you doing?" So beware of misleading marketing claims. Everything that has a benefit in medicine also comes with risks. I can't think of anything that a doctor or nurse can do to a patient that doesn't have both a benefit and a risk. If you give someone a drug, the benefit is it can cure a disease, but it can also cause side effects. We all know this. If you do surgery, you can cure the cancer, but you also cause scarring and other complications. So everything we do in medicine comes with risks, even using AI or software to manipulate data or do something with data. So you have to use standard risk management frameworks to identify hazards, causes, hazardous situations, and harms, and you have to quantify those risks. So part of the regulatory work is not only to measure the performance and the clinical benefit, but also measure the risks. Why do we do this? Because you can only get regulatory approval if your benefits outweigh your risks. The regulators are very happy if you are honest and upfront and say, these are the benefits measured. Here are the risks measured. Benefits greater than risks. The regulators go, brilliant, thank you very much, you've got regulatory clearance. And people forget, and companies don't like admitting their device has risks. But everything in medicine does, everything in life does, essentially. So don't be shy about discovering or talking about risk. So very briefly, what would that mean if you wanted to develop clinical AI? You write a very clear and unambiguous intended use statement. You classify your device according to the risk classification. You identify your clinical benefit. You identify your risks. Great. Now you have to do the technical work. This has been mentioned already, ISO 13485, the standard for quality management systems. You have to install and use a quality management system, because if you don't, the regulators won't accept your documentation. You have to develop your product using your quality management system. So you can't develop the product first and then retrospectively build a quality management system because you haven't built that AI in a quality assured way. And then you can do your clinical studies. And there's 3 phases, which we'll talk about in a bit. Very briefly to touch on quality management systems, these are kind of like this ethereal concept that no one really understands. But it essentially is a blueprint for ensuring quality within your company. The way I explain it to our clients is, imagine everyone in your company got on a bus tomorrow and that bus drove off a cliff. You now have to hire a whole new team. How do they continue building the same medical device to the same standard? Because it's all documented in your quality management system. That's the point of a quality management system. And you cannot bring a medical device to market without a QMS. Having a QMS is so important, you cannot even apply for an audit for a medical device authorization without being audited for a quality management system first. So this is like the most central thing you can do once you've decided you're a medical device. I'll give you a very practical example. Your company decides that because you're using data and dates in your data, that you should probably write all the dates in the same format. Because we all know the Americans like to swap things around. So we don't know if you're talking about the 11th of February or the 2nd of November. So your company goes, right, we're going to do this. And instead of just like speaking about it, you write this down. You create a standard operating procedure and you reference the international standard for date and time format, which says we're going to write the dates like this. You say why we've chosen the dates like this. You say how we're going to use this date format and what we're going to do if someone in our company uses the wrong date format. You then train your staff. You document and record who's received the training. If someone then goes along and writes the date in an incorrect format, you do a root cause analysis, which you document. Did they receive the training? Did they understand it? You then perform corrective actions. You review their work. You go back through all their documents and check all the dates that they've written. And then you do preventive actions. You retrain that person. This is a quality management system because you can see how it's almost impossible, if everybody is trained appropriately in this system, for someone to write the incorrect date. And that's just a very simple example, but this applies to any practice that in your company. So I did this in my business. Like I ban people from writing dates in any other format. Now, the clinical evaluation, this is broken down into a 5-step process, and then it's followed by economics. Economics is not part of the regulation, but it is important for selling into the NHS. It's part of the NICE evidence standards framework. So you've got your intended use statement, and then you draw up your clinical evaluation plan. Your evaluation plan says, I'm going to do a literature review. I'm then going to do all of these steps, and we're going to talk about what it is. And then the final thing that you actually submit to the regulator is the clinical evaluation report. And a lot of people just jump straight to an investigation. They forget to do all of these steps. So first of all, you have to demonstrate clinical validity. So this is a little pilot study in line with current gold standards, which you've discovered from your literature review. And you must prove all the claims that you make in your intended use and measure the intended clinical benefits. People go, okay, well, what kind of study do I need to do? One of these 3 types of studies. Editorials don't count, case reports don't count, blah, blah, blah. You need to do proper studies. I've not seen many RCTs of AI systems, to be honest. We've seen quite a few case control and cohort studies. You plan it in what's known as a CIP. You justify the design of the investigation, and just like for drugs, you produce an investigator's brochure, CRFs, informed consent procedures, and a document a monitoring plan for adverse events, using the tools like we saw Lewis present earlier. You have to have a partner site. You have to have a clinical trials unit involved. You might need to have a data monitoring committee. You'll certainly need ethical approval, which in the UK is done through IRAS and the Health Research Authority. And the bit that people forget is you need to apply for an exemption from the MHRA. These are the regulators in the UK. You can't do a study of a non-regulated medical device without the MHRA saying so. And do you know what they look for before you apply for exemption? Your QMS. So people often come to us going, we've got a trial design and we've been rejected. I'm like, have you got a QMS? No. Right. Let's put one in. Clinical investigations must be done to this standard. If you are GCP trained as an academic, you already understand the principles of this standard. This is just the formal international version of GCP. Same thing. So complete the course or hire someone who's GCP trained. This is the investigation process for the MHRA. They've now streamlined it. So when you apply for an ethics approval, there is a button to say, also notify the MHRA. And you press that button, and then it comes up, pay the fee. And you're like, what? I have to pay a fee? Yes, you do have to pay a fee. You have to pay, what is it now? Depends what class of device you are, but it's a couple of £1,000 essentially, for them to review your documentation. And they will say, can we see your QMS documentation? Can we see your intended use? Can we see your clinical trial protocol? I know I'm running out of time. Investigation design, blah, blah, blah. Are you claiming better than current standard of care, et cetera, et cetera? Do you need a comparator arm? Is it going to be prospective or is it retrospective? What's your ground truth? All these kind of stuff. General academic best practice. This is what the regulators expect you to do. Anyone in academia will be very good at doing investigational design. And again, make sure your outcomes align with your intended clinical benefit and the intended use. I see a lot of people do these studies and they don't align with the intended use. And you're like, why did you do that study? You just spent thousands of grant funding money and you haven't measured one thing that the regulators are going to ask you to show. So it's really important to align that. And don't come up with your own metrics. I know a lot of people go, oh, we've invented this new score, but we've given some sexy acronym. And the MHRA will go, oh, we don't know what that score is. That score's not validated. Why didn't you use a standard metric? So don't try and invent new scoring systems either. I don't think we've got time for examples. I was going to go into some. Once you've done the investigation, you document it all in a CIR, and you have to measure the safety performance and any risks that were identified during the study. And then you put all of that into a clinical evaluation report. And the last bit is then to write 2 things: the post-market surveillance plan. How are you going to monitor the performance of your device on market through all channels, including social media? And how are you going to monitor the clinical performance of your device post-market? People forget about this all the time. There are AI systems across the NHS being used right now, especially in radiology. No one knows how accurate they are post-market. There are systems diagnosing stroke in sort of 16 hospitals, and the companies have no feedback as to how accurate they are. And they will get pulled from market eventually because the regulators, who will audit you once every 5 years, will say, what's your post-market performance like? And people go, no. In fact, I'll tell you a story. We had one company came to us, they failed their repeat audit, and the regulator had written, I'm going to paraphrase, said either your device got better post-market or you didn't collect any post-market data. I suspect it's the latter. And they were given 3 months to collect post-market data or they'll be taken off market. And we managed to turn it around. Small concepts of regulatory readiness levels. Academics are kind of here. Experimental proof of concept. And as people have alluded to before, building an academic research piece and publishing it, you get to about here. 4 is when you start building your QMS and start thinking about classifying your device. That's when you can do your first actual clinical investigation. That is when you can actually put it in the hands of doctors and patients. So it takes time. You can't skip these steps. Final note, I did mention, because of our post-Brexit state, we're kind of in this state of flux. There's going to be much stronger alignment with the EU MDR, especially that up-classification of risk for most Class 1 software devices. And there's going to be much more impetus put on post-market surveillance and the vigilance of these devices. The MHRA have also said, look, we're a very small regulator on an island nation state. What we need to do is actually think about international recognition. Shall we continue to recognize CE marking from the EU? And in addition, shall we recognize things coming from America, Canada, Australia, and other jurisdictions, which I think is a great idea. The MHRA has also announced for people building AI devices something called an AI airlock. So they realize that people with AI devices want to put things into hospital systems to do pilot studies, but often they're not quite ready to be fully deployed in the clinical world. So they're producing what they're known as an airlock, where you kind of put it in an air-gapped but data-rich environment or simulation environments where the AI can function. So if people are building AI devices now and want to test them in the NHS, this airlock system is being set up. And they also have what's known as the IDAP, which is a kind of streamlined regulatory pathway for innovative devices as well. We have a few clients going through this IDAP process. So what do I want you to take home? This is my last slide, I promise. The regulations are common sense. Okay, they don't ask you to do anything that a sensible, ethical person would do, right? It's make claims that are sensible, that you can measure and prove, document your quality assurance, do the appropriate clinical study, get ethical approval, write it all down, and submit it to a regulator. That's it, okay? But it's not just the regulators who want to see this documentation. When you're selling to the NHS, as we heard before, they have the DTAC. If you've done all of this, the DTAC is the easiest thing in the world to complete because you've got a risk management framework in your QMS. You've identified your clinical safety objectives. It's super, super easy. The only additional work is on the cybersecurity side of things. And the last thing to say is that every medical device comes with benefits and risks, and you have to measure both. It's very exciting to measure the benefits, I get that, but you have to measure the risks, and that's the only way to get regulatory approval. I think that's it. Thank you very much.